Hello, this is Chuck Fithian. This is the third segment of the lecture looking at 17th century Kent county. In our previous two sections, we looked at topics such as settlement pattern, social structure, river landings, agriculture, tobacco production, material culture. In this one, I want to explore two other aspects of life on the frontier, and that is foodways, and to come back to the theme of how the environment influenced colonial settlement and how settlement influenced the environment. Much like settlement patterns, what people eat is probably one of their most important cultural features. It also represents an important adaptation they have to make when they move into new areas. So English foodways, as the English colonized the New World, their foodways had to adapt and integrate new and different things that were very different from what they had been using in their homeland. So again, in this particular case, the archaeological record is particularly important. The documentary database records it as well, but the archaeological record has a particular sensitivity to recording this because it preserves food waste, the actual byproducts of the processes that we're going to talk about. So again, our archaeological collections provide clues to what colonial Delawareans were eating during the period. And this is a selection of animal bones from a variety of archaeological sites. And there's a wide range of wild and domestic sources. This is a group of large mammal bones, mostly cow and pig. These are bird bones, and these are fish. So the kinds of animals that are being seen are things like deer, cows, pig, sheep, and then a variety of wild animals that we'll talk about in a minute. So they're drawing upon and utilizing a range of different sources that are both wild and domestic. And I want to come back to that theme in just a moment. To that also is a range of shellfish, oysters, clams, and whelks. Whelk seems to have been a part of colonial Delaware diet. And what's interesting about it is we really don't see them in dietary patterns from the Chesapeake and in other areas in North America. Whelks are a large marine gastropod. Many of you have probably found whelk shells at the beach during family vacations or trips, weekend trips to the beach. But what happened with these is that these animals were collected and they were boiled, and the animal fished out, and was the opening that you see here is actually where the shell was cut open and the meat was extracted. Again, we've not really seen that in other areas in the Mid-Atlantic. So this kind of is a really distinctive feature in Delaware foodways. Many of you have probably eaten, whelk, at like Caribbean restaurants or restaurants that bring in sort of a fusion, type of menu. But colonial Delawareans were eating them along with other ranges of shellfish. This particular clam is a freshwater clam from a site that's actually upstate, up in Newcastle County, where they were exploiting that resource in addition to these others. But that's a topic for another day. So when we look at this, what we see is this mix of wild and domestic. So one of the questions we had is, does diet change? Does it evolve over a period of time? Research in the Chesapeake, notably, by Henry Miller, looked at 17th century diet throughout the course of the 17th century. And what he found is that in the early phases of colonization, Chesapeake colonists were eating a whole variety of different kinds of things, probably stuff that back at home they would have considered culturally offensive. And then over time, that gradually lessens, and domesticated animals, as they become more available, as herds get developed, tend to become more dominant, driving the wild resources into a very secondary, kind of role. Is that what we see here? And the answer to that question is not very clearly. What we see is domesticated animals are present at the outset. Cows, pigs, predominantly. So they had them at the time of colonization, which is again an interesting kind of an interesting contrast. But with the Chesapeake. But what's interesting is the wild resources doesn't disappear. Wild fish, deer, squirrel, things like that persist in Delaware diet. So we don't see that nice even trajectory that Henry saw in the Chesapeake. Instead, we see a dietary system that is based on domestic animals from the beginning and includes wild resources and includes them over a long period of time. And I'll give you just one example of how long that persists. There's a letter from John Dickinson, and many of you know who he is. Was involved in the American Revolution and constitutional period. He talks about coming down to Kent County at the end of the 18th century. And he mentions that since he had been at his home, which is out on St. John's Neck, he had eaten beef only one time. The other things were fish and wild bird. So it's really interesting. Here's a guy who's, by all standards of the period, is very elite. So he could have easily eaten beef all the time, that if he chose to do so, but he didn't. So he records this interesting sort of perspective on colonial diet in Delaware that seems to be a very old practice. That even among some of the elite, they're still using sort of this mixture of wild and domesticated animals together. So again, as we look at the animal bones from both wild and domestic sources, we're seeing Delaware standing out as distinct from its neighbors in close by areas. We also wanted to look at oyster utilization. We had some archaeological deposits from the town of Dover and one of the plantations, and we thought, well, this is a great way to look at oyster utilization, which was a very important topic in Chesapeake studies. Again, do we see the same patterns? Do we see some differences? So we looked at the collections that were from the town of Dover, dating from the beginning of the 18th century, as well as the late 18th century. Now you may ask, well, why are you looking at that? Because you're looking at the very early colonial period. We wanted to use the late 18th century as kind of an endpoint, as kind of a marker to see if our early patterns would be continuing. And perhaps and then provide some avenues for looking at other resources. So it gives us a chance to look at a rural deposit and two urban deposits. So here's the pattern. Here's the pattern that we saw. Now this looks at oyster type. Oyster's shape gets determined by the environments that they grow up in. So easily acquired oysters are going to be very round oysters found in shallower water. The deeper water oysters are going to be very long, where they grow in clusters. And also salinity regime tells us where they're going to get it. If it's a very high salinity regime, it's probably not in the St. Johns River. It's probably out in the Delaware Bay or perhaps even along the coast. If it's a lower salinity range, it's going to be somewhere closer to home. So what we see, so here's our rural plantation. Here's our two deposits from Dover. Here's our rural plantation for salinity. Here's the rural plantation. Here's the one in Dover. And if you notice, the patterns are just about identical. That over the course of the period from about 1690 to almost the end of the 18th century and beyond, the same type of oyster was being harvested repeatedly. The same oyster from similar salinity regimes was very predominant as well. So this is indicative that one, this natural resource was very abundant, and it was also exploited very heavily over an extraordinarily long period of time. So shellfishing in Delaware in the 17th century was a fairly simple affair. People waded out into the shallow water with rakes. They found these oysters that were living somewhat individually in areas that you see, brought them in, collected them, and then consumed them at their plantation. Now, how about seasonality? In other words, what time of year were they being found at? Here's our rural plantation, and here's our two urban plantations. Again, two very different patterns. This is a pattern that we see a lot on rural plantations. Is a harvesting that begins probably late in the spring, extends through the summer, and then peaks out in the winter and spring. Here, it's up and down. Each one of these markers shows different time of year it's being harvested. We're not getting that sort of bell curve that you see here in the first one. So that's telling us that the consumption of oysters in the urban environment was different than the rural environment. This also probably speaks to the presence of shellfish markets that had been developed to supply the taverns here in town. As a provincial seat, Dover, was important as a county, for county government. So you have people coming in, and they're going to be taking advantage of the ordinaries and the taverns and things that are here. And frequently on the menu, it's going to be oysters, but they're going to be consuming them all year round, apparently, kind of based on our patterns that we see here, which is very different than the earlier rural plantation, where it's a very seasonally oriented. They're used beginning at a certain point in the year and stopping, at a certain point in the year. One of the other aspects that we're seeing is the emergence of tonging for oysters. Oyster tongs begin to show up in probate inventories by just a little bit before the American Revolution. And there's probably a good reason for that. We suspect that what's happening is the shallow water oysters are starting to get scarce. So they're looking to move further into deeper water and extract those oysters there. And that's why we're seeing the tongs. And we also can see that through the calculation of the age at the time of the oyster at the time of its harvest. So here's our rural plantation again. Here's one in Dover. Here's the Strickland site, which is nearby up near Smyrna. DeRoss stores near Smyrna, and then here's our other one from Dover. And these are arranged chronologically from the earliest to the latest. And what you can see is the oysters harvested early were 4.5 years old, an unstressed population. Here's a group at 5 years old. So at this point in time, the oyster populations are still relatively healthy. They're not showing any signs of overexploitation. But look what happens as it gets more recent. 3.5, 6.8, and we'll explain that in a minute, 2.6. So the oyster age at harvest has been halved over the course of the 18th century. So what we're seeing is that the oyster population, remember that one particular kind of species of oyster that got targeted for so long, is starting to show signs of stress and overexploitation long before the American Revolution begins. Why this one is so high is, we went back and took a look at it. This is all the deeper water oysters that have been collected by tonging. So that's why you have this later site, and all of a sudden they spike up, the age spikes. That's because these oysters are being extracted out of the deeper water, and therefore they've been there longer and have longer ages at the time of harvest. So from the vantage point of an oyster, we're seeing a huge impact on the natural resource in the Delaware that started as a result of colonization, where our earliest deposits are pretty healthy, unstressed populations, to one that's starting to become overexploited within a relatively short period of time. To give you a point of contrast, this type of pattern does not show up in the Chesapeake until much later in time. Again, a very different estuary, but one that's similar enough for comparison. Botanical remains. This is a peach pit. This is a walnut haw and corn cob. These survive in carbonized states in these deposits. So it gives us an idea of other aspects of diet as it relates to cultivated plants, as well as ones that are being harvested in the wild, such as the walnut. The charcoal analysis also gave us a way of looking at the impact of colonization on the natural ecosystem. The Webb's Landing site dates the late 17th, early part of the 18th century, right? Right here to give you a reference point. This is Bowers. The Webb's Landing site's right there. We had a large collection of charcoal that had been preserved in that well that I showed you earlier. So we talked to a wood anatomist. We talked him into taking a look at that to see if we could identify species of trees that were growing, with the idea being that the charcoal is going to reflect what would naturally have been around the plantation itself. We're having to account for cultural selection, but we feel that it would be representative of the kinds of trees that were growing in the immediate vicinity. Is that alike what we're seeing today, or is it very different? And what we saw was this group of trees. This combination really surprised everybody, because this site is out on the low coastal plain It's only like a half a mile from Delaware Bay, but we're getting this wide range of tree species that's present at the time, but they're not present now, which is really interesting. We talked to specialists of the Natural Heritage Inventory in Natural Resources Department, and they were kind of surprised to see this sort of variation of trees being found. And their comment was that you're not going to find that in that area today. You're going to find like remnant individual types, but this combination, this group as a whole, you're not going to find that. To get this, you're going to have to go to more upland areas that you would see up in northern Delaware today. Say like the grounds of Winterton Museum or along White Clay Creek, something like that. That type of mixed forest composition. That's the only place that survives in Delaware today. So the point of this is that here's, oysters and charcoal have given us clues into the effects that colonization had on the natural environment. We've talked a lot earlier about how the natural environment influenced individuals and what they chose to do. Well, here's a case of that reciprocal relationship of where the actions of humans started altering the environment. And it did so really early. So as we look at other sources of information to kind of use along with this, we see references to hunting seasons where because animals were being exploited. We see restrictions on firewood because of the reduction in timber. We're seeing cleared areas that represent where forests once stood. So we're seeing a very altered landscape during colonization, and it's a landscape that had a trajectory much earlier than we see somewhere else. We're not 100% sure as to why Delaware was impacted so extensively in comparison to other areas. It could be the form of the land itself, these nicks and the handoff that extend off from the main part of the state itself. They're bordered by river systems and things like that. And maybe that served to focus the exploitation. We're not really sure. That's not a particularly satisfactory explanation. But as population increased, as colonial society developed, there were fairly serious impacts and inroads into the natural environment. So this is an overview of this project. There's a lot of things we didn't get into, and I wanted to kind of give you an idea of the kinds of topics that we're looking at. We have a lot more of this to do, a lot more scholarship, a lot more thinking about what we're seeing. Hopefully, extraction of new evidence, new data from archaeological sites and the historical record to kind of look and begin to kind of further this project along and expand its interpretations. But one of the things that we're seeing, to come back to the theme, is that from the vantage point of Kent County, we're seeing an area that's very distinct culturally. That the Delaware Bay produced a society that had very distinct social, environmental, and cultural features. Different patterns of immigration, different adaptations of the landscape, different social composition, different ranges of material culture. All of this served to help create this area and create it as a distinct area. So from our perspective, we should not look at colonial society in Delaware and along the Delaware Bay as a shadow of anywhere else. It is its own distinct cultural area, had its own tenor, it had its own patterns that evolved through complex interaction with the natural environment, complex interactions with the people that occupied that environment. That concludes the third section of today's lecture on 17th century Kent County or Delaware. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you a sense of how distinct Delaware has been throughout its history and continues to be. We do plan on doing more research, so hopefully we'll be able to push some of this data out and answer some of these questions that we've addressed today. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I'd like to take a moment to thank institutions and individuals for their very generous support and help with this project. Thank you very much.